Okay, so how we've helped families engage in the anti-bias projects that we have at Belrose Children's Centre. We do it in a multifaceted way that isn't just one piece of communication style. We need to acknowledge that families receive communications in many different forms, and they also absorb it differently depending on what you're trying to deliver at any different time. So if it's high value and you'd really like to get out of why, it really needs to be in a documentation form coupled with both communications in person. So the way that we got our families engaged in it is the Komochi's program is a social emotional program. So whatever program you have at your service, you can attach an anti-bias element to it in your communications. So for example, our Komochi's program, we changed the pronouns of our Komochi characters, which was explaining different characters in their books in order to explain an emotion. So each character usually has an emotion or a temperament attached to them. So Kat, for example, is one of our Komochi characters, and Kat tends to be quite excitable, but can also be a bit too over the top. And Kat was originally female. So that overly emotional to over the top was associated with female, and what we were finding is the boys it wasn't resonating with them because, that Kat's a girl. That's not about me. I'm not over the top and overly emotional. Well, sorry, there's lots of little boys that are highly emotional. So it's any sort of project that we do, whether it be in the service, whether it be a Komochi social emotional program or reading a literacy book like Dear Zoo and changing the pronouns, we then, in our evaluation of that and communication to families, add the element of what we changed and why it worked and why we did it. So that is one element of how our families become engaged, because then they ask questions. You want questions. And this is where the challenge comes, and you've got to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because you want those questions, because it's like children. No development occurs without challenge. So unless you're challenging a child, there's no development occurring. Unless you're challenging people in the community, whether it be your children, whether it be your families, whether it be your staff, there's going to be no development unless you challenge them. And challenge sometimes is a little bit uncomfortable with that, but that's okay. That's what you want. You want the questions. You want to educate. And some people you're not going to be able to help, and they've made their mind up, but the ones that you can, they're the ones you're targeting and the ones that will really get on board. Usually we have questions come through. They usually come through two platforms. So they can come through directly through Educar, so they can respond to our literature and documentation online, or they can write it on our program boards in the room, or they can communicate to staff. That's then reflected upon in our staffing teams and then actioned on thereafter. Another way is resource sharing. So parents really enjoy feeling an engagement with the service, and not everybody has all the funds or the know-how or the access to the resources that we are privileged to have in our services. And I think sometimes we take that for granted as professional teachers and educators, is that we think that they have access to everything. They don't, and they have to go looking for it, but they don't know where to start. So one of the things that we got families is we have a literacy program where we share books home, because obviously the first 5 years it's good to get 1,000 books before school. That is a New South Wales government and Department of Education initiative. They want children to read up to 1,000 books a year. So part of our thing in getting children and families engaging in literacy at home was we send books home. So our previous program was a project that we really wanted to embed Indigenous practices into our service, because we, although we don't have children that identify and families that currently identify as Indigenous, we embed those practices in our operations as a blanket, because that's part of our nation and we recognize that. So what we did is we recognized that that was really successful in that resource sharing of sending books home that were Indigenous based, Aboriginal based, Dreamtime stories. And we had a lot of conversation and flow through from families. What we did is then we started sending home, instead of just them all being like we called it the mascots. So we'd send a little toy, cuddly toy, and a book home with children. And they would take photos with their parents reading the book, and they'd usually have the little cuddly toy sitting on their lap because, you know, it's a little bit of fun and making literacy fun. And their family taking a photo, and we made a collage up into our foyer. And what we did in order to encourage our anti-bias project and to give families more of an insight and understanding of it, because we had a lot of families come and say, I have no clue how to talk to my son about two mums, two dads. I have no clue anything. I wasn't brought up like that. I'm totally out of my element. And then with that came the fear and stress. So then that can result in, them being a little bit aggressive when they're speaking to staff. They went, I don't have any idea. So we sent home, we started including in that resource library to go home, and we just pop it in a little calico bag, pop a book home that we were reading at the service, and we'd send them home, and we'd cycle through the room over a month. So they'd usually get a couple of Indigenous books a month, and they'd get a couple of anti-bias books a month. And then we also included because that was our other project, a social emotional aspect on how to sort of calm our emotions and breathe through, because we had a behavioural element here due to our children with trauma at our service. So it's about adding value to what you currently do at home to engage them into what you're currently doing. And that's how we found is sharing resources is one of the biggest things. It's not enough to have a couple of books out in the foyer. Your families won't feel the right that they can take it. So how are you going to engage them in a way that makes them feel like they have a right to access that, a right to participate, a right to take it home and read it? It's also a little bit of a forced issue as well. So if you send it home and you're sharing that resource, and or even you could, if you're budget conscious and you don't have all these resources to share, printing out a little typed up story that you've copied and pasted from the internet. There's lots of things that you can do. Laminate them all, send them home with a few pictures on them, get the children like a little task to do. Parents love engaging with the service. The way that we got that comfortable feeling uncomfortable, so this is at many years after our start of our journey, anti-bias journey. We've got a lot of families that are very passionate in this area because their children identify differently or are neurodivergent or language other than English. It just doesn't stop at children that are it's all children, including all children, whether it be a child that's peg fed at a table. It's that anti-bias approach is normalizing your context. And the way that we really identified that our families were really picking up momentum, we did a philosophy review at the start of this year. And one of the biggest highlights from our philosophy board was about they valued the fact that their children had access to many different things regardless of gender. And that bled through our philosophy input from our families. So we thought, well, how do we keep going with this and create a community of learners where our families can learn something and they can learn it with us? So sometimes we're not experts and that's okay, but I think families, if they know that you are with them on the journey, and it's not just like, here's the information, off you go and do it. It's if you invite them in to your service, they will come. And you may get people that will come that won't agree with your philosophy. So we were planning on that, and we wanted that. So we wanted our ones that were a little bit resistant to it to come along and had an expert speak. So we planned a presentation and I called it a network learning community. So I invited families and staff. There was also other families from other Northern Beaches Council services that were invited to this anti-bias night. We called it anti-bias presentation night, where families and teachers could learn in a learning community about anti-bias education on how that looks in an early learning environment and also further on down the track and why it's important. So I had, I think it was 30 odd families attend, and then we had family daycare educators from the Northern Beaches Council area, other teachers from other areas attend as well online. So we offered both choices. So families could either attend in person in a learning community, or they could attend online because obviously they have young children and it's hard. So we've also thought about inclusive access to that information night. So that needs to be considered if you're ever going to try and engage them with a information night. We also did it after 7:30. So I know it's late for all the staff, but we did it quite late, thinking children are usually to bed, in bed, finished at about 7:30. So we put all of that into play. So know your audience and know your target audience if you're going to plan something that you want them to engage in. So then that gives them the opportunity to engage in it. And we presented on an anti-bias curriculum, how it links to the EYLF. So we linked the curriculum that we're doing and why we do the project. So just overrunning why, talking about our success on where we've gone with it. Then we had a moment where parents could ask questions, and it was a open forum where they could ask questions. We did get challenging questions, and it was more about, because we'd given them the information on the brain science and the brain development and children's trauma responses and their responses if they're not, if they're fearful of not, being who they are and the outcomes and whatnot, and how that's the EYLF. We actually had more parents ask questions to go, well, how can I talk to them about that? What if they want to be a boy one day and a girl one day? And we got a guest speaker, Mr. Alistair Gibbs, and he came along and he was very helpful in saying, well, that's okay, because it's all about being okay within yourself. If you girl one day, boy the next, they'll eventually decide what they choose to, and they may not choose either. And that's perfectly fine too.